In the half-light of an ancient room, there is often a small silence that seems to listen back. A lamp burns low. Stone walls keep their coolness. Somewhere beyond the window or beyond the doorway, the night moves softly over roofs and gardens and distant roads. And in that quiet place, Cassandra appears, not as a loud figure, not as a warrior, not as a queen with bright banners, but as someone standing a little apart from the noise, someone who seems to know that a moment can be beautiful and difficult at the same time. Her story belongs to the old Greek world, but it has a strange way of feeling near. It is a story about voices and hearing and the uneasy space between warning and belief. It is also a story about a city, Troy, with its tall walls and polished gates, and about a princess who lives among the slow rhythms of palace life while carrying a gift that is not always a comfort. The old tales say she could see what was coming. That alone would have made her life unusual. But in myth, unusual gifts often arrive with hidden weight, like a small sealed jar carried carefully through a quiet hallway. So let us wander gently through her story and not rush it. Cassandra's life is found in fragments, in echoes, in the surviving habits of ancient storytelling. A few lines here, a family relation there, a warning spoken to someone who does not listen. And because the tale is incomplete in the way so many ancient tales are incomplete, there is room to pause beside it. Room to notice the marble dust on the floor. Room to imagine the sea beyond the city walls. Room to follow a voice that reaches toward the future and then fades softly into the past. Cassandra was said to be the daughter of King Priam and Queen Hecuba, rulers of Troy. In myth, Priam's household is large, crowded with children and with the atmosphere of an old and important house. There are many names around the edges of the Trojan story, and they move like shadows through doorways, each carrying some small part of the larger fate of the city. Cassandra is one of those names, but not a distant one. She stands close to the center, close enough to see the fine details of court life, the woven cloths, the polished vessels, the careful speech, the long knowledge that royal families sometimes carry of how fragile their power really is. Troy itself is remembered through poetry as a place of walls and gates, a city that looked toward the sea and toward the plain. Ancient storytellers gave it a sense of height and distance, almost as if it were built a little above the ordinary world. The city is often imagined in a warm light, with dust rising from roadways and with the gleam of bronze catching the sun. Even the sound of its name has a measured shape. Troy, brief, firm, and old. Cassandra would have grown up in that setting among rituals and expectations. Princesses in myth are often described in relation to what they will marry, what they will lose, what they will preserve, but Cassandra's defining feature is not simply family or rank. It is perception. The old stories place a different kind of attention in her, one that sees patterns before others do. She notices what is forming at the edge of things. She recognizes danger while others are still at ease. That kind of awareness can feel like a gift in the abstract, and then in daily life like a kind of loneliness. One of the quietest things about Cassandra's myth is that it turns knowledge into an atmosphere rather than a trumpet blast. She is not given the kind of prophecy that fills a hall with certainty. She does not stand as if above all human feeling. Instead, she seems to live with the difficult nearness of knowing and not being able to make that knowledge rest comfortably in the minds of others. There is a soft sorrow in that. A person can say the right words and still not be heard. A person can see the storm gathering and still be met with the ordinary confidence of afternoon. The tale most often told about Cassandra begins with Apollo. In Greek myth, Apollo is a god of many bright things: music, distance, discipline, healing, plague, and prophecy. He belongs to sunlit order and also to severity. A god like Apollo can bring clarity, but he can also make clarity feel cold. In the stories of Cassandra, he offers her the gift of prophecy, or perhaps the opening toward it, and then, when she does not return his affection, he places a curse upon her so that her true predictions will not be believed. This is one of those old mythic scenes that feels strangely still, as if it were painted in a room where no one speaks above a whisper. Apollo's temple, with its carved stone and measured steps, is a place of elegance and power. Cassandra stands there and the air seems to change around her. The gift is not simple. The curse is not simple either. The stories differ in details, as old stories often do. Some versions say Apollo promised her foresight in exchange for love, and when she refused him, he could not take back the gift, so he altered its effect. In some telling, he breathes on her lips. In another, he spits into her mouth. The image is stark, but myth sometimes uses starkness to mark a deep imbalance. What remains constant is the feeling that something luminous has been turned difficult. It is worth pausing with this for a moment, because the old myths often understand emotional truths in a very compact way. Cassandra's curse is not merely about one god and one refusal. It is about the experience of possessing insight without social power. It is about the loneliness of being correct in a world that prefers reassurance. Many stories, even outside myth, know this feeling. A warning can be gentle. It can arrive early, it can be spoken with care, and still it passes into the air unnoticed while life goes on with its own pace. In the household of Priam, Cassandra would have been one voice among many, but in the surviving myths her voice takes on a special stillness. She becomes the person who speaks of what others do not want to imagine. She warns of the wooden horse. She speaks of danger at the gate. She sees the ruin before it has finished arriving. And because the story is known to us after the fact, her words have a tragic clarity. We know the outcome. The listener inside the myth does not. That difference gives the tale its hush. There is something almost domestic in the way tragedy gathers in Troy. The city is not only a place of grand armies and famous heroes. It is also a place where people eat, sleep, sweep floors, pour wine, and tend to children. This ordinary texture makes Cassandra's role feel even more tender. She is not warning an abstract crowd. She is warning a household, a city, a world of familiar faces, a mother, a father, brothers, sisters, servants moving through corridors. Each warning in imagination is like a hand placed quietly on a table before speaking. The voice is steady, but the room does not always answer. Among Cassandra's brothers is Hector, the great Trojan defender, remembered as noble and deeply human. There is a softness in imagining that Cassandra, too, stood in some family room and looked at the same walls, heard the same footsteps, breathed the same evening air. Mythic families are often large enough to hold many moods: pride, affection, impatience, duty, fear. Cassandra's own mood, as preserved in the stories, often carries a grain of sadness, but not despair. She keeps speaking. That matters. She keeps seeing, she keeps naming what comes. Sometimes the old stories feel like pottery fragments in the dust, a painted curve here, a broken line there. We do not have the whole vessel, but enough remains to guess at the shape. Cassandra appears on these fragments in several ways. She is a prophetess, she is a princess, she is a woman caught between divine attention and human disbelief. She is also, in later traditions, a figure of sharp intelligence, someone who understands the price of knowledge. Her voice in these stories is not loud, but it is persistent. It returns, and because we are moving slowly, it is pleasant to notice the smaller details around her. The rooms of Troy may have smelled of olive oil, wool, wood smoke, and dust warmed by the sun. The palace courts may have had potted herbs, painted jars, bronze basins, and the quiet discipline of people accustomed to ceremony. Outside, the plain would have stretched wide and pale, with horses and carts and the steady horizon of war beyond. Inside, Cassandra would have lived among thresholds. Thresholds are important in myth. They are places of arrival and departure, places where a person may stand for a while, not yet fully in one world or the next. The prophecy itself in myth is a curious thing. It is often treated as a power, but it can feel like an ache. To see farther than others is to live with extra weather inside the mind. The future may arrive in flashes, not as a full map, but as brief and unsettling shapes. A fire in the distance, a broken wall, a face turned away. Cassandra's burden was not only that she knew, but that the knowing did not create obedience. Understanding and influence are not the same. The old myths understood this with a simple, almost severe honesty. There is also a quiet irony in Cassandra's relation to Apollo. Apollo is associated with prophecy, but the prophecy in Cassandra's life becomes a place of contradiction. The god of light does not bring her the ordinary comfort one might expect from light. Instead, he leaves her with an interior brightness that others cannot trust. It is as if she carries a lamp that only she can see. That image feels especially fitting for a bedtime listening story. A lamp in an inner room, a flame guarded by the hand. The room around it is dim but not empty. The Troy cycle as it comes down to us includes many voices and many kinds of knowledge. There is the fierce knowledge of warriors, which is often immediate and bodily. There is the practical knowledge of rulers, which concerns alliances, food, walls, and ships. And then there is Cassandra's knowledge, which is quieter and perhaps more difficult. She knows what a sequence of events will become. She knows that choices made in small confidence may later become irreversible. In that way, she is one of myth's great figures of consequence. She reminds us that the future can be present long before it becomes visible to everyone. Cassandra's warnings about the wooden horse are among her most famous moments. The horse itself is one of mythology's most enduring images, partly because it is so simple and so strange. A great wooden object left by the shore, a gift that is also a trap. A shape that invites curiosity. In many retellings, Cassandra speaks against bringing it inside the city. She sees the danger hidden in what appears peaceful. Others, exhausted by war or tempted by relief, do not accept her words. There is a delicate sadness in that scene. The city wants peace. The city wants to believe that the war is over. Cassandra stands at the edge of that hope and sees a shadow moving underneath it. It is easy to imagine the horse standing in the sunlight, its wood dry and pale, its outlines too smooth, too deliberate. Around it, perhaps people walk and talk and discuss what to do. Some are cautious, some are eager, some simply want the long siege to end. Cassandra's voice is there, but the myth has already taught us the answer. The choice has been made. Troy will open the gates. The story will turn. The city will sleep in one kind of peace and wake into another kind of ruin. And yet Cassandra's role does not feel empty, even when it fails to change the outcome. That is one of the quiet lessons woven through her myth. Speech is not meaningless simply because it is refused. Warning is not erased by disbelief. In the old stories, Cassandra keeps her dignity in the very act of speaking. There is a kind of moral grace in continuing to name the truth when no applause follows. This is not the grace of victory. It is a smaller and more intimate grace, one that belongs to persistence. If we linger in the ruins of Troy for a moment, the scene becomes even more still. Broken walls, ash, scattered stone, and the sea beyond. Ancient cities are often remembered as if they vanished all at once, but in real life, of course, collapse can be messy, stretched across fear and exhaustion and smoke. In myth, the burning of Troy becomes a concentrated image of the end of an age. Cassandra stands among the last hours of that world, her warnings now part of the city's final air. It is a haunting kind of responsibility to see the end coming and to still inhabit the place that is ending. In some later traditions, Cassandra's story continues after Troy falls. She is taken away, often associated with Agamemnon, the Greek leader who brings her as a captive to Mycenae. This part of the myth has its own shadowed quiet. A princess of Troy, already marked by the curse of being unheard, is carried into another house, another kingdom, another fate. The stories surrounding her remain heavy, but even there the old narrative does not entirely abandon her. She is still the one who knows, still the one who recognizes the danger ahead, still the one whose insight moves ahead of the room around her. In Aeschylus's drama Agamemnon, Cassandra appears in a deeply memorable scene. She is silent for much of the moment, and then, as if the pressure of her visions can no longer be contained, she speaks with dreadful clarity about what lies in the house. The ancient audience would have known the broader myth. They would have understood that her words point toward the murder waiting inside the palace. There is a strange stillness in that scene too. Cassandra hesitates, then enters the house of death. Her knowledge does not free her from the doorway. It accompanies her to the threshold and beyond. That threshold image matters. Cassandra's life is full of thresholds, at Troy's gates, at Apollo's shrine, at the door of the Greek palace, at the boundary between knowing and being heard. In myth, thresholds often carry a soft pressure as if air changes there. A person may pause just for a second and look back. Cassandra seems to live in that second. The second before the warning is accepted. The second before the door closes. The second before the future becomes the present. The persistence of Cassandra through literature is also interesting. Many mythic figures become fixed in one role, but Cassandra continues to shift as later writers and artists return to her. She appears as a symbol of truthful speech that is dismissed. She becomes a figure for the loneliness of foresight. In some interpretations, she is almost a representative of the tragic intellect, a mind that understands pattern but cannot shape outcome. In others, she is a human voice inside a divine unfairness. Each retelling adds a shade, and the shades gather around her like evening light on a stone floor. Even her name has a gentle resonance. Cassandra. It has a long, singing shape with soft consonants and a final open sound. Names in myth often carry music, and some seem to hold a faint memory of old rooms and old fires. Cassandra's name feels both clear and distant. It is easy to imagine it spoken in a palace corridor, called across a courtyard, whispered in a tragic play. It lingers. As bedtime stories go, there is a particular comfort in returning to figures like Cassandra, even when their lives are marked by sorrow. The comfort does not come from cheerful endings. It comes from the steady shape of the tale itself. The world is old, the voices are ancient, the outcome is known, and because it is known, the mind can settle beside it. A story with a fixed horizon gives the listener room to rest in the middle distance. Cassandra's myth offers exactly that kind of middle distance, a place where the warning can be heard slowly, and where the meaning of being unheard can be considered without haste. It is worth thinking, too, about how prophecy works in these old stories. Prophecy is often treated as a supernatural skill, but it can also resemble a heightened attentiveness. In practical terms, people who live close to danger may learn to notice small signs: the movement of smoke, the timing of footsteps, the strange quiet of a room. Cassandra's myth may preserve in heightened form that human sensitivity. She notices what is becoming. The world around her remains fixed in its habits. The tension between those two conditions gives the story its long, low hum. And there is another quiet layer here. Cassandra's curse, the failure to be believed, is not only a personal tragedy. It is also a social one. Communities suffer when truthful voices are ignored. Ancient myths often understand this through symbols and divine intervention, but the pattern is familiar. A warning dismissed can become a catastrophe later. A careful voice can be overlooked because it is inconvenient. Cassandra's story, then, reaches beyond Troy. It keeps returning in different forms wherever someone sees danger early and finds the room unwilling to listen. Still, we do not need to press the story too hard. For a calming evening, it is enough to let the images arrive gently. A woman in pale robes on stone steps, a temple courtyard with warm dust, a city wall in late afternoon light, a wooden horse standing near the shore, a procession carrying torchlight through a narrow gate. Each image is simple on its own. Together they form a quiet chain. The old world is made of such chains, one scene touching the next, until a whole civilization seems to rise, breathe, and fade in the span of a story. Greek mythology often gives us grand heroes, but Cassandra is interesting because she is not one of the grand triumphant kinds. She is a witness. She is a voice. She is someone whose power is almost entirely inward and therefore fragile in public. Yet myth remembers her. That memory itself is important. It means that ancient storytellers and the readers who came after them found something enduring in the figure of the ignored prophetess. Perhaps it was the tension between clarity and helplessness. Perhaps it was the dignity of someone who still speaks. Perhaps it was the sadness of being right too early. The old sources are not always consistent about the details of Cassandra's life, and that uncertainty has its own quiet charm. Myth is not like a ledger. It is not meant to be exact in the modern sense. It breathes through variation. One poet emphasizes Apollo, another emphasizes the fall of Troy, another dwells on the aftermath in Mycenae. Together, the versions create a larger silhouette. Cassandra's shape remains recognizable even when the lines shift. That is often how the best remembered figures live in the imagination, not as fixed statues, but as forms seen repeatedly through changing light. If we imagine her walking through Troy at dusk, the city may have been full of the kinds of ordinary sounds that make life feel safe: pots being set down, a door sliding closed, a distant call, the soft scrape of sandals. Somewhere, someone may have been grinding grain or folding cloth or washing hands in a basin. Cassandra would have moved through these same sounds while carrying a knowledge that made them fragile. The ordinary can continue right up to the edge of change. That is one reason myth feels so human. It understands how easily a peaceful room can be standing inside a much larger turning. Later artists often placed Cassandra in dramatic poses, one hand lifted, eyes turned away, mouth open in warning. But perhaps the more lasting image is quieter than that. Perhaps she is sitting near a window. Perhaps she is looking across a courtyard where nothing seems to be happening. Perhaps the warning is already in her, unspoken, waiting for the right moment. There is a stillness in that kind of anticipation. The world keeps its shape. The future is already leaning against the edge of the day. Her tragic inability to be believed is also a kind of inversion of the usual desire for prophecy. Most people imagine that knowing the future would bring peace. Cassandra reminds us that knowledge alone does not always soothe. Sometimes it isolates. Sometimes it makes ordinary life harder to inhabit. To know the shape of a coming sorrow can make every present comfort seem thin. A cup on the table, a lamp shining in oil, a child laughing in another room, all of it is still there, but now it is touched by what is coming. Myth understands that tenderness and foreknowledge can live side by side. There is, in some versions, a purity to Cassandra's refusal of Apollo. She does not simply belong to the god who offered her prophecy. She belongs to herself as well, even if the story punishes that refusal. The myth may reflect ancient ideas about divine power and mortal obligation, but it also gives a hint of personal independence. Cassandra does not become a passive vessel. She resists. Whether the cost is fair or not, the story remembers the resistance. And in that memory, she remains more than a warning machine. She is a person with choice, however constrained. The ancient world often placed women in roles that modern readers want to question, and Cassandra is especially important because her story holds both constraint and authority. She is a princess in a patriarchal household. She is a woman in a war story. She is a prophet whose insight does not translate into power. And yet her voice survives, perhaps because it captures a deep human contradiction. To understand something deeply is not the same as being able to alter it. That realization can be painful, but it can also be calming in its truth. The world is filled with things we can see but not control. As the tale settles, we might return once more to Troy at night. The city walls are dark now. The sea is a deeper color than it was by day. The stars above the plain are steady and remote. Inside the palace, Cassandra may be awake when others sleep. Prophetic figures in myth often belong to the night hours, when the mind is more open to unsettling patterns. But she is not always dramatic in this role. Sometimes she may simply sit in the quiet, listening to the house breathe around her. The future in such moments is not a thunderclap. It is a presence with patient feet, and that is part of what makes Cassandra so enduring for listeners who are drifting towards sleep. Her story is full of distance and recognition, of warning and endurance, of rooms and thresholds and muted light. It does not demand urgency. It simply remains. It asks us to notice how a voice can be clear and unheard, how a gift can become a burden, how a city can continue for a while even while its ending has already begun. These are not loud ideas. They are slow ones. If we let the ancient scene soften even further, we can almost hear the fabric of the myth itself. The rustle of a robe, the murmur of a courtyard, a god's promise spoken in a temple, a refusal, a curse, a warning, a silence in response. Then later, much later, the smoke of Troy, the house at Mycenae, the final recognition that Cassandra was right. The story moves like water in a shallow basin, changing shape with each touch but never losing its reflective surface. Cassandra's place in Greek mythology is sometimes overshadowed by the louder figures around her, but perhaps that is fitting. She belongs to the margins and the thresholds, to the places where a listener has to lean in a little. Her myth is not about conquest, it is about awareness. It is not about victory, it is about the delicate and painful fact of seeing, and seeing in old stories is one of the most mysterious acts of all. The night deepens gently around that thought, the palace corridors empty, the torches lower. The city of Troy in imagination becomes only a few pale shapes against the dark. Cassandra's voice remains, but softer now, as if carried on a distant breeze. It does not insist, it does not argue. It simply lingers, like the last warmth in a room after a lamp has been turned down. Some myths end with a clear closure, but Cassandra's does not really close. It continues in echoes, in later poetry, in paintings, in the language we still use when we speak of someone who is a Cassandra, meaning a person who warns accurately and is still ignored. That phrase itself is a small monument, a quiet stone set in the language. It keeps her alive in a modern way, not as a distant relic, but as a recognizable shape in human experience. And perhaps that is the calmest thing to carry from her story. Not the curse, not the fall of Troy, not even the image of Apollo's bright and difficult attention. Perhaps it is simply this, that some voices are lost for a time and then found again much later in a different room. Ancient stories often wait patiently for their listeners. Cassandra, too, seems to wait, standing somewhere between temple and palace, between warning and aftermath, while the centuries move quietly past. So let the story ease now. Let the marble steps grow dim. Let the bronze lamp burn smaller and smaller. Let the walls of Troy become only a faint outline, and beyond them the night air, broad and unmoving. Cassandra's life, as the myths preserve it, is one of strange clarity and gentle sorrow, but it is also a story of persistence. She speaks, she knows, she remains, and for a little while, as the room grows still and the listening mind loosens its grip, that is enough. The sea beside Troy would have continued making its soft repeated sound, wave after wave, long after the last speech in the hall. That is how the world goes on in old stories. Kings argue, cities rise, gods interfere, prophecies are spoken, and yet the sea keeps arriving at the shore in the same patient way. Cassandra's tale sits beside that sound. It does not shout above it. It is more like another rhythm, quiet and human, moving just beneath the surface. In some imaginations, the prophetess is nearly always seen in a moment of urgency, but there is room to think of the calm hours too. The hours before the warning, the hours after it. The long evenings when knowledge sits in the body like a secret weight, a cup of water, a fold of cloth, a window left open to the dark. Myth does not always tell us what happens in those hours, but we can sense them. They are part of the texture. They are where sorrow learns its own shape. Cassandra's brothers, her parents, the city around her, all belong to the broader human pattern that myth preserves so well, the pattern of families carrying hopes they cannot fully manage. Troy is not just a symbol of downfall. It is a home before it is a ruin. That is important to remember. Every famous ending was once an ordinary morning. Cassandra lived in that ordinary morning for many years, among greetings and rituals and familiar faces. Her gift meant that even the ordinary had a shadow laid across it, but the ordinary was still there. Bread was still broken, water was still drawn, the sun still struck the walls at noon. It is easy in retelling myths to make them seem larger than life in every direction, yet Cassandra's appeal lies partly in how small and close her experience can feel. She is not a storm god or a founding king. She is a person inside a family, inside a city, inside a set of difficult truths. That human scale makes her unforgettable. It lets the listener imagine her not only as a symbol, but as a presence in a doorway or at the edge of a room or standing beneath a painted beam while the afternoon light shifts across the floor. And so the story can remain with us as we drift, a daughter of Troy, a speaker of warnings, a woman whose knowledge outpaced belief, a figure of Apollo's bright and unsettling gift, a survivor of one city's fall and one house's darkness. Cassandra is many things at once, and all of them feel slightly hushed, as if she were speaking from the other side of a curtain. In that hush, the old world becomes gentle again, not because the events are gentle, but because distance has softened their edges. The columns are pale, the lamps are low, the names are old. Cassandra's voice, once so hard for others to receive, now reaches us with almost no resistance at all. And maybe that is one of the quiet consolations of myth. Time changes the listening. So let the listening continue a little longer without effort. Let the image of Troy drift into the night. Let Apollo's temple fade into stone and shadow. Let the wooden horse become only a shape in the imagination, neither moving nor threatening now, just part of the old pattern of the tale. Let Cassandra remain not as a cry, but as a steady point of awareness, one of those ancient figures who stay with us because they know how to stand in the middle of a difficult truth and still speak softly. And with that soft speaking, the story does not so much end as settle. It becomes one more quiet room in the long house of Greek mythology, one more lamp turned low, one more voice preserved in the dark. Cassandra waits there still, among the columns and the dust and the patient sea, and the night at last grows restful around her. The night can be understood as a kind of ancient coverlet laid gently over the world. Cities disappear beneath it, mountains lose their sharpness. Even the sea, which never truly rests, seems to lower its voice. In that softened hour, Cassandra's story feels especially close because it belongs to the places where knowledge and silence meet. She is remembered as a prophetess, but she is also a daughter of a particular house, a listener in a particular hall, a person standing within the fine and fragile architecture of an ancient city. That city, Troy, has become so famous through poetry that it can seem almost unreal, yet it would once have been experienced in very practical ways. There were doorways to cross, steps to sweep, jars to fill, walls to inspect after a windy day. There were smells of smoke and grain and wool. There were ordinary conversations carried on under the same sky that would one day become legendary. It is one of the gentler mysteries of old stories that they hold both the vast and the small at once. A myth can contain a whole war and still leave room for a hand resting on a stone ledge. Cassandra's tale has that same double life. It belongs to the grand movement of destiny, but it also lives in the human pause before someone is believed. That pause may be the truest part of it. A warning spoken too soon, a face turned away, a room full of people who do not want the future to enter the present. Such scenes are not loud in the way battle is loud, but they can shape a life just as deeply. The ancient Greeks, like many peoples, understood prophecy as something both beautiful and dangerous. A message from beyond the ordinary world was never entirely comfortable. To know what is coming is not always to be comforted by it. In fact, knowledge can make a person lonely in a very particular way. Cassandra's loneliness is part of what gives her story its enduring softness. She sees, and seeing does not save her from the ache of being dismissed. That ache is not dramatic in a theatrical sense. It is quiet. It sits in the chest. It waits through meals and conversations and evenings by lamplight. It is the kind of sorrow that can become part of a person's posture, almost invisible to others, but present all the same. Apollo, in the old telling, grants Cassandra the gift of prophecy, and then, after being refused, leaves her with the burden of speaking truth without receiving belief. Different versions of the myth describe this with different shades of severity, but the essential shape remains the same. A divine favor becomes a human trial. That is a familiar pattern in mythology, where gifts often arrive with a shadow attached. Fire warms and burns, wisdom illuminates and isolates, beauty draws the eye and invites envy. To look at Cassandra through this pattern is to see how myths express an old understanding of life, that even the things we desire most can carry a cost we only learn later. Perhaps this is why Cassandra has remained so memorable across the centuries. She is not only the person who knew too much. She is also the person who could not make others share her knowing. That is a sorrow many lives can understand in smaller, quieter ways. Someone sees a problem in a family and cannot persuade the others. Someone notices a change in a friend and is brushed aside. Someone senses a storm in the air long before the clouds gather. Cassandra's greatness in myth gives a large shape to a very human feeling, the feeling of speaking carefully into a room and hearing the words fall somewhere short of their destination. The old world in stories like this often seems far away until one notices how familiar its emotions are. Ancient palaces may differ from modern rooms, but uncertainty still gathers in them the same way. A mother may still hope, a father may still misread danger, a child may still sense the mood of a household before anyone names it. Troy in the poems is not merely a political center or a fortified city. It is a family place. It contains pride, tenderness, rivalry, routine, and fear. That is why its fall matters so much. A city can be broken like a vessel, but it is also a home filled with people who knew where the cracks in the floor were, who knew which stair creaked, who knew how the light moved in the courtyard after noon. There is comfort, strangely enough, in remembering these details. They remind us that the past was once lived as a present. It was not all legend. It was also laundry, dust, and the patient tending of food and fire. The imagination can restore that world to a softer scale, one in which no single catastrophe defines everything at once. Even in a myth of ruin, life continues until the moment it cannot. Cassandra lived in that interval. She knew the names of rooms before they were emptied. She knew the sound of feet on familiar stone before those stones became part of the memory of a fallen place. Some ancient stories survive because they are beautiful, others because they are frightening. Cassandra's survives because it is both, but also because it contains a particular kind of human tragedy, the tragedy of being accurate and unheard. In the long history of storytelling, there are many figures who predict disaster. Very few are as emotionally lasting as this one, perhaps because her fate does not allow the usual relief of fulfilled triumph. She does not convert the city. She does not avert the horse. She does not become the victor of her own narrative. Instead, she remains within the sharp edge of unheeded truth, and that makes her unusually tender in memory. The Greeks often imagined prophecy as coming through altered states, sacred places, or divine possession. The oracle at Delphi is the most famous example, though there were other shrines, other voices, other sacred pauses in the landscape. A temple was not just architecture. It was a point where ordinary life seemed to bend. Incense, stone, silence, and the murmur of inquiry all gathered there. Cassandra's prophetic gift belongs to that same atmosphere of contact between human and divine, yet her own experience is different from the public certainty of an oracle. Her knowing is intimate and unhappy. It does not offer authority so much as estrangement. This difference matters. It makes her feel less like a ceremonial mouthpiece and more like a person who has been left holding a message no one wants to hear. The most haunting myths often rely on this kind of emotional imbalance. The listener feels the injustice, but also the inevitability. In Greek mythology, fate is not usually a thing to be negotiated away by wishfulness. Even gods are limited by the older pattern of destiny, though they may influence it, delay it, or twist it at the edges. That larger order can make the human figures within the myth seem fragile, like candles on a long stone table. Cassandra is one of those candles. Her light persists. It is not large, it is enough to show the shape of the room. And what a room it is in the mind, the palace of Troy, the corridors, the thresholds, the private chambers where counsel is exchanged, where hopes are spoken, where decisions begin to harden into fate. One can imagine a late afternoon in that place, the sound of activity settling as the day leans toward evening. The air perhaps carries the dry warmth of the Anatolian coast. Outside, the land stretches in muted colors, and in the distance the sea remains a steady companion. Ancient cities were always in conversation with their surroundings. Wind, weather, and water were never far away. A fortress could feel immense and still be at the mercy of seasons, of fire, of siege, of the slow exhaustion of time. Cassandra stands within that environment as one of the most poignant witnesses in myth. Witnesses are often overlooked in stories because action seems to matter more than observation, yet observation can be a form of suffering and also a form of memory. The witness sees what others pass over. Cassandra sees the future, but she also sees her own people in a state of refusal. That refusal gives the story its bitterness, but the bitterness is tempered by the elegance of the mythic telling. Ancient stories rarely linger on psychology in a modern sense, yet they often reveal it with remarkable clarity through repeated scenes, through gestures, through small acts of speech and silence. If we slow the tale down, as bedtime invites us to do, we can imagine those repeated scenes. Cassandra speaking. Cassandra being listened to politely and then ignored. Cassandra perhaps pausing after a warning as if waiting for the room itself to shift. Cassandra observing the confidence of others. Cassandra carrying her awareness from one day into the next. There is nothing hurried about this image. It belongs to a world where time can feel broad and measured, as if the hours themselves were carved from the same stone as the city walls. It may also be worth remembering that Greek myth was never fixed in one single version. Poets told the stories differently across generations. Tragedians emphasized different wounds. Vase paintings caught different moments. Later Roman writers inherited and reshaped the tales again. Cassandra appears in Homeric tradition, in tragedy in later literature, and in the art of the ancient and post-ancient world. Each time she is slightly altered by the interests of the age. Sometimes she is most tragic as a doomed princess, sometimes most terrible in her clarity, sometimes most moving as a prisoner of war. This shifting life in art is part of what makes mythology feel so quietly alive. The figures are not frozen. They are remembered differently by different centuries, like stars seen from different latitudes. In the archaeology of memory, such a figure becomes layered. There is Cassandra, the character in epic poetry. Cassandra, the subject of dramatic lament. Cassandra, the image on pottery or in later sculpture. Cassandra, the name that survives in modern language as shorthand for an ignored warning. That last survival is especially interesting. Few ancient figures become common words. When they do, it usually means the old story has pressed itself into the everyday. A Cassandra is a person whose foresight meets disbelief. In that way, the myth has crossed from the realm of temples and epics into ordinary conversation. It has become part of how people describe social life, politics, family dynamics, and human stubbornness. There is something almost restful about that persistence. It suggests that old stories do not vanish. They soften into the grain of language. They continue to live quietly, embedded in phrases, images, and instincts. One might speak of a Cassandra moment without even thinking of Troy. Yet the original figure remains behind the phrase, standing in the fading palace light, still trying to be heard. That is how myth often works. It becomes so familiar that we forget how specific it once was. But beneath the broad modern usage lies a woman in a Bronze Age imagination, a woman shaped by the literary world of heroes, gods, and collapsing halls. The Bronze Age itself is worth a moment of calm attention. Long before the classical temples and marble statues most people picture when they think of Greece, there was a world of citadels, trade routes, seal stones, and administrative tablets. Mycenaean civilization and the wider Eastern Mediterranean formed a web of contact that moved goods and ideas across water and land. Troy, or a city near the archaeological layers associated with Troy, stood in that interconnected region. It was not isolated. It belonged to a world where merchants, sailors, diplomats, and migrants moved between communities that spoke different languages and worshipped different gods. That broader landscape gives the myths a deeper resonance. They are not floating above history. They are in part made from it. A story like Cassandra's may preserve the memory of a real city, though the myth shapes that memory into something larger than record. Archaeology can tell us about walls, gates, pottery, destruction layers, and rebuilding. It can hint at trade and conflict. It cannot fully recover the lived texture of voices in a courtyard. Myth, on the other hand, cannot give us measurements or dates in the same way, but it can preserve emotional truth. Between the two lies a quiet space of uncertainty, and that uncertainty is strangely beautiful. It allows both the scholar and the dreamer to stand together at the edge of what can be known. The ruins themselves, whether imagined or excavated, have a particular kind of silence. Stone remembers without speaking. Broken pottery, buried ash, charred timbers, foundations cut into the earth, all of these become evidence and also poetry when viewed after long centuries. When we think of Troy now, we think not only of Homer's lines but of the real labor of archaeology, the patient brushing away of soil, the measuring of strata, the careful interpretation of fragments. The 19th and 20th centuries brought renewed attention to Troy, and those searches, though sometimes dramatic in their own right, also remind us that the ancient past is often recovered one small piece at a time. Cassandra belongs to that recovered past in a symbolic sense. She is a fragment that has become whole in the imagination. Her voice comes to us through translation, adaptation, and cultural memory. The exact timbre of her speech is lost, but the emotional outline remains clear. She warned. She was not believed. The warning came true. The city fell. She survived only to encounter further suffering. It is a simple shape, but simple shapes can carry great weight, especially when they are repeated through centuries of retelling. And there is another softness in the story if one chooses to hear it. Cassandra is a figure of speech, yes, but she is also a figure of endurance. To continue speaking when one is dismissed requires a kind of quiet resilience. It does not always look heroic in the conventional sense. There are no trumpets. There is no victory procession. There is just the persistence of the voice itself. In this way, Cassandra resembles other tragic women of myth who remain inwardly steadfast, even when their outer circumstances unravel. One thinks of Antigone, though her story is different, or of Hecuba, or of Andromache. Ancient literature is full of women who witness catastrophe and do not stop feeling its full weight. Their grief becomes part of the cultural memory of the Mediterranean world. The Greeks and Romans were deeply interested in the relation between speech and power. Who gets to speak? Who is believed? Who is silenced? Who can interpret signs, dreams, omens, and portents? Cassandra's story engages all of those questions at once. She speaks the future, but her words are socially weak because of curse, disbelief, and perhaps the human tendency to reject unwelcome knowledge. That tension is still recognizable. It has never really disappeared. In councils and courts, in households and institutions, there are always those who see danger early and are told to be calm, to wait, to stop worrying. Myth, in its patient way, offers a mirror for such patterns without ever needing to modernize them explicitly. If we let ourselves imagine Cassandra not in the dramatic aftermath, but in the quieter interludes, her life becomes more intimate. She may have known the smell of summer figs and fresh clay. She may have passed under woven hangings. She may have stood beside women preparing wool or listening to household news. Even in royal settings, life was made of very small tasks. Ancient palaces depended on work that rarely appears in the heroic poems. Someone managed stores. Someone fetched water. Someone cared for children. Someone made garlands for festivals. Cassandra's presence in that world becomes more touching when one remembers how much of life was non-epic, repetitive, and necessary. The gods and heroes enter the story, but the day still has to be lived one bowl, one basket, one conversation at a time. There is a special kind of peace in the repetition of daily life. The same path walked at dawn, the same courtyard at noon, the same stars appearing over the roofline at night. If Cassandra lived with knowledge of destruction, then each repeated day must have contained both routine and ache. The routine did not vanish. It simply took place under a different sky in her inward life. This is a subtle form of tragedy, one that is easier to feel than to name. It gives her figure a strong hold on the imagination, because it suggests that catastrophe can coexist with continued ordinary action for quite some time. People still eat, still speak, still mend garments, still hope. The future may already be standing nearby, but the present continues its slow work anyway. In ancient literature, horses often carry symbolic weight, and the famous wooden horse of Troy is among the most enduring images in world story. It is also a strangely quiet image, despite its dramatic consequences. A horse is a creature associated with movement, speed, power, and war. A wooden horse, by contrast, is motionless, deceptive, and enormous. The contrast itself feels almost dreamlike. Cassandra's warning about it is one of the most famous examples of prophetic truth denied. Yet if we pause over the image, there is another layer of strangeness. The horse is not only a trick, it is also a container of expectation. The city receives it, studies it, debates it, and in that interval, fate settles in. That kind of dramatic irony is a gift of epic storytelling, but it also resembles the way life sometimes works in hindsight. Looking back, we see the small hinge moments, the odd choice, the missed signal, the remark that should have mattered more. Ancient myths are especially good at shaping this recognition into memorable form. Cassandra's life becomes one of the purest examples of a truth visible too late, yet the story is not merely about error. It is also about the mystery of human judgment. Why do people distrust the right voice and embrace the wrong one? Why do warnings sometimes fail where persuasion succeeds? Myth does not answer these questions in a modern explanatory mode, but it leaves them gently open, like a window in the evening. The evening is a fitting companion for this story. Ancient households by lamplight must have had their own shadows and silences. Oil lamps made a small circle of brightness, leaving the rest of the room in soft obscurity. Within that brightness, faces seemed more reflective, more inward. One can imagine Cassandra in such a light, the gold of the flame steadying and then wavering with the air. The room could hold conversation, but it could also hold the pause after a troubling word. Those pauses are important in myth, even when the texts do not dwell on them. They are where listeners imagine their own emotional responses, where the old story becomes a private scene. Cassandra's association with Apollo adds another layer of ancient resonance. Apollo was a god of prophecy, music, healing, plague, distance, and measure, a deity who could seem clear-eyed and bright but also severe. His domain included the orderly and the devastating. In many ways, he stands as one of the most complex gods of the Greek world. The association with prophecy makes perfect sense, but the curse in Cassandra's tale reveals the darker side of divine attention. The gods in myth are not moral abstractions. They are powerful personalities, and their gifts can expose human vulnerability rather than remove it. This makes the myth feel older than comfort. It belongs to a worldview in which contact with the divine is not automatically safe. Still, even that severity has its place in the great tapestry of old religion. Ancient people did not approach the sacred casually. They knew that blessing and danger often arrived together. Oracles could guide cities and still be unsettling. Sacrifice could seek favor and still reflect anxiety. Ritual itself was a way of living with uncertainty. In that atmosphere, Cassandra appears as a figure of sacred burden. She does not simply have a power. She bears something costly and inescapable. That burden links her to many tragic mediators in literature, those who stand between what is known and what can be acted upon. The more one lingers with her story, the more it becomes not just about Troy's end, but about the loneliness of perception. There are times in life when understanding arrives before the rest of the world is ready for it. A child notices attention adults hide. A sailor reads weather signs in the clouds. A healer senses the seriousness of a symptom before it is named. A historian sees the outline of a vanished civilization in scattered remains. Cassandra becomes a patron of all such lonely clarity, though hers is the most intense version because it carries the scale of destiny. She knows, but knowing only deepens the gulf between her and others, and yet she endures in memory not as bitterness alone. There is dignity in her persistence. There is beauty in the ancient determination to speak even when speech seems fruitless. In Greek tragedy, the chorus often helps the audience feel the breadth of suffering without demanding a solution. Cassandra's presence in such a world would be deeply fitting. She stands in relation to lament, prophecy, and witness. Those three qualities belong together in a way that feels almost musical. One hears them as variation on a theme, a slow and solemn pattern repeated with subtle difference. Music itself was central to the ancient world. Lyres, pipes, chanting, and the measured recitation of poetry all helped shape collective memory. The poems that preserved Cassandra also preserved rhythms of sound. Even when we read them silently now, they retain something oral, as though they were meant to be spoken into a room rather than scanned on a page. That oral quality gives the myth a restful pulse. It is not abrupt, it unfolds. Cassandra's name, when spoken, has a gentle clarity to it. The story around it, though severe, can still be narrated in a lull of voice rather than a burst. This may be part of why bedtime is such a natural setting for her tale. Sleep, like prophecy, involves a crossing of thresholds. The mind loosens its hold on ordinary sequence. Images drift in and out. The future may appear disguised as dream. Ancient peoples, including the Greeks, paid attention to dreams as meaningful spaces, though not always in a simple way. Dreams could warn, comfort, confuse, or merely echo the day. Cassandra occupies the border between waking knowledge and the strange logic of what is foreseen. She is, in that sense, a figure of threshold states, of the in-between, of the hour when one is not quite asleep and not quite fully awake. The borderland quality of her story also fits the geography of Troy, a city imagined at the edge between Anatolia and the Aegean world, between East and West in later cultural memory, between history and legend in our own understanding. Such border places often accumulate stories. People travel through them. Goods pass through them. Conflicts are drawn toward them. Myths settle there too because the imagination loves places where things meet. Cassandra stands at one of those meeting points, where the future comes close enough to be spoken and the present resists being changed. If we look beyond her immediate story, we see that Greek myth repeatedly returns to the tragedy of unreceived knowledge. Calchas, Tiresias, the Delphic oracle, dream interpreters, seers touched by divine insight, all these figures show that foresight in myth is both prized and problematic. Yet Cassandra differs because she remains trapped inside a specifically human form of failure. It is not only that prophecy is difficult, it is that social trust fails. That detail makes the myth quietly modern in feeling, though its setting is ancient. A warning is no use if the hearers have already chosen their own story. This tension has fascinated poets, playwrights, and readers for centuries. In later art, Cassandra often appears with disheveled hair, lifted hands, or a gaze turned away from those around her, as if the inner world she inhabits is more immediate than the visible one. Painters have used her figure to express alarm, solitude, and the terrible beauty of being right too late. Even when art makes her dramatic, the underlying emotional truth remains calm and terrible rather than loud. She is the voice that slips through the cracks of certainty. The ancient Mediterranean world itself was full of such cracks. Civilizations rose, traded, transformed, collapsed, and were reimagined by their successors. Mycenaean palaces gave way to smaller communities. Homer's poems remembered a world already half lost. Later Greeks looked back through those poems and built their own cultural identity in conversation with them. Rome later inherited the myths and carried them into new languages and landscapes. In each stage, Cassandra persisted. She moved from oral tale to literary emblem to cultural symbol. It is a remarkable journey for one figure, and it reminds us that stories can become vessels of memory almost as enduring as stone. Still, even stone is vulnerable. Earthquakes, fire, weather, and human reuse all alter what remains. This is one reason ruins are so affecting. They show that permanence is always relative. A wall can stand for centuries and still become a fragment. A city can be abandoned and then buried. A name can vanish from local speech and later return through excavation or reading. Cassandra's own prophetic burden might be seen as a kind of ruin in advance, a life lived with knowledge of loss before the loss arrives. That makes her story feel strangely archaeological, as though she were excavating her own future long before anyone else could see it. The future in myth is often less a line than a shadow. It falls across the present before the event itself is visible. Cassandra lives with that shadow. It shapes her relationships. It changes her solitude. It may even alter the way she hears familiar sounds. A footstep in the hall can become ominous. A festive gathering can hold the taste of mourning already. Such details are not in every version of the story, but they belong naturally to its emotional atmosphere. They help us imagine how a prophetic burden would feel across ordinary time. And ordinary time, after all, is where most lives unfold, not in the big scenes, but in the long stretches between them. That is perhaps the most restful lesson the myth can offer. It tells us that the most famous endings were once lived through one unremarkable hour at a time. Troy did not fall in a single abstract instant. It had a history of days before that final night. Cassandra's life had mornings and dusk and small interruptions. She knew the city as more than a symbol. She knew it as habit. She knew it as home. Home in ancient stories is rarely simple. It can shelter and trap. It can preserve memory and also demand sacrifice. Cassandra's home becomes the place where her warning matters most and is least welcomed. That paradox gives her story its enduring ache, yet there is tenderness in remembering her now. To remember is to do, in a small way, what her people could not do in the myth. It is to receive the warning after the fact, to hear the voice that history once disregarded, to let the figure stand in dignity after the collapse. The collapse itself is one of those mythic events that seems always to recede into the distance and remain present at once. Troy is gone, and Troy is still here in literature, in archaeology, in names of ships and cities, in the echo of a horse made of wood, in the solemn face of the prophetess who could not be believed. That double existence gives the story a kind of peace. Nothing is entirely lost if it can be spoken again, even softly. The old walls may be broken, but the telling continues to place them for a moment in the mind. As the hours grow later, the tale grows even gentler. Apollo's bright severity becomes a distant glow. The palace corridors blur into shadow. The wooden horse recedes into a silhouette against memory. Cassandra's face, which artists have rendered in many ways, becomes less an image than a feeling. Alertness, sorrow, patience, and the quiet burden of truth. She need not be rescued for the story to matter. She need only remain present in our listening, and she does. There is a lovely stillness in that. A story can survive without resolution. A voice can outlast the failure to hear it. An ancient city can live on in imagination long after its stones have changed hands, been buried, or broken. Cassandra's quiet curse is not only a mark of tragedy, it is also a form of persistence. The curse does not erase the voice. It keeps the voice moving through time, from one reader to another, from one century to the next, like a lamp passed carefully in the dark. And now, as the tale settles once more, we can let it rest beside the older rests of the night. The sea continues its steady movement beyond the shore. The stars hold their distances. Somewhere in the far memory of the Mediterranean, a city waits in ruin and in splendor both, and a woman stands within it, speaking what she sees. Her words are carried forward by poets, by historians, by artists, by the long, patient appetite of memory itself. They come to us in a softened form, no longer to warn of imminent disaster, but to remind us how fragile belief can be and how enduring a single honest voice may become. So let Cassandra remain there in that dim and enduring chamber of myth, where ancient walls are quiet, where the lamp burns low, where the future has already happened and the past still speaks. Let her speak softly now. Let the listening soften with her. Let the old city drift farther into dusk, and let the night, wide and untroubled, close gently over the story until only its calm outline remains. Before the silence settles completely, it is worth lingering a little longer in the world that made Cassandra possible. Ancient Greek myth was never only a collection of grand adventures, it was also a way of giving shape to uncertainty. People watched storms roll in over the sea, watched harvests fail or flourish, watched children grow into strangers, watched empires rise and then thin out like mist. In that world, a prophetess who could see the truth and not persuade others to see it too would have felt strangely familiar. Her story gathers up a human fear as old as speech itself. What if the most important thing is spoken plainly and still does not reach anyone? That fear is gentle in the telling, but deep. It belongs not only to kings and cities, but to ordinary lives. People have always known the experience of being certain about something and finding no one ready to trust it. The myth gives that private ache a magnificent setting. It moves the feeling into the halls of a Bronze Age palace, among banners, oars, and sacrifice fires, and in doing so it makes the emotion easier to behold from a restful distance. A listener can look at Cassandra's fate and recognize the shape of disappointment without having to stand inside it. The ancient world loved signs. A crack in a vessel, an unusual flight of birds, smoke rising in the wrong direction, the unexpected stillness of a sacred grove. To us, these may seem like fragments of superstition, but to earlier societies they were part of a patient conversation with the unknown. The people of the Eastern Mediterranean lived close to weather, war, and the sea. They understood that life could pivot on what could not be controlled, so they built rituals, omens, offerings, and stories. They listened to seers because the future often arrived in forms that needed interpretation. Cassandra belongs to that old habit of attention. She is a figure of watching. She looks and sees more than others wish to see. In some tellings, her power is linked to Apollo's gift and Apollo's punishment. In others, the detail is softened or varied, as myths often are when they pass from one region to another, one poet to the next. That variation itself is restful to consider. It tells us that the ancient world did not preserve its stories like glass locked in a case. It carried them like water in many vessels. A tale could change shape and still remain itself. Cassandra's curse, then, is also a story about survival through alteration. Her voice appears differently in Homeric echoes, tragic stage versions, Roman retellings, and later reflections, and yet the central sadness remains clear. She knows, she says, she is not believed. There is a quiet beauty in the repetition of that pattern, though beauty is not the same as happiness. Repetition makes a myth usable. It lets the story move from palace to theatre, from theatre to manuscript, from manuscript to modern memory. Something of Cassandra persists because her role is so legible to the human heart. There is no need for a complicated explanation before the feeling arrives. We understand the loneliness of being correct too early. We understand the strain of seeing a danger that others dismiss. We understand the strange exhaustion of trying to say something true in the wrong room at the wrong time. And perhaps that is one reason the myth remains so alive after all these centuries. It has a still center. Around that center the details can shift, but the calm burden remains. Apollo, in the mythology of light and music and prophecy, is a god of clarity, and yet here clarity becomes cruel. The gift of sight is divided from the gift of persuasion. Truth is made to travel without shelter. The result is tragic, but also strangely modern in feeling. Many people have experienced the difference between knowing and being heard. Cassandra's story does not need to be translated for that to be understood. If we step back from the myth and let the ancient landscape widen, we can almost see the older layers beneath it. Troy itself was not only a literary city. It was also a place associated with an actual archaeological site, later uncovered and debated, layered with settlements built one upon another over long stretches of time. The remains at Hisarlik in modern Turkey have invited generations of scholars to imagine the world that inspired the epic cycle. Stone walls, fortifications, and buried strata offer their own kind of silence. They do not speak in sentences, but they do keep company with the stories. The city of legend and the city of excavation are not identical, and yet they stand near each other like reflections on water. One is composed of poetry, the other of earth and broken masonry. Between them lies that ancient region of uncertainty where history and imagination meet. It is easy at first to imagine the Trojan War as a single thunderous event, yet the mythic and historical background suggests a much slower unfolding. Trade routes crossed the Aegean. Small kingdoms negotiated, feuded, allied, and dissolved. Coastal cities watched the movements of ships. Bronze was valuable. Grain mattered. Horses mattered. Alliances mattered. The world of the late Bronze Age was full of dependencies and fragile balances. A war, if it came, would not have felt abstract. It would have pressed into households, markets, temples, and kitchens. Cassandra's warnings in that sense are not only prophetic, they are civic. She is trying to preserve a world already under strain. There is something almost soothing in imagining how many people in that world went about ordinary tasks while great events gathered in the background. Someone mended a tunic, someone ground grain, someone poured oil into a lamp, someone carried water from a well. Children argued softly in a courtyard. A servant swept the dust from a threshold. Such details are not in the grandest versions of the myth, but they belong to its atmosphere. They remind us that even catastrophes arrive in the midst of repetition. The day does not announce itself as legendary. It begins like any other day, with the sun lifting over roofs and the scent of earth warming in the light. Cassandra must have lived among those ordinary motions, even in the dramatic frame of the story. She would have known the sound of footsteps in hallways, the arrangement of jars, the rhythm of meals, the changing color of stone by hour and season. This makes her fate feel more intimate. She is not only a figure of destiny, she is a person rooted in daily life, and the tragedy is that her insight is denied not in the abstract, but in a place she knows well. A home is a house of habits, and habits can make disbelief feel natural. If everyone has always dismissed the warning before, they may continue to do so simply because they are accustomed to it. And yet the myth does not make Cassandra merely passive. She speaks. In some versions she resists. In some she cries out in desperation. In others she becomes almost statuesque in her knowing. This variety gives her a deep humanity. She is not reduced to a single expression. She is the full measure of what it means to witness without control. The ancients understood that such a condition could be tragic, but they also understood that it could be noble. A speaker who continues to tell the truth, even when ignored, occupies a difficult kind of dignity. The value lies not in the outcome, which is sorrowful, but in the act itself. To say what is real is not always to change the world, but it is still an act of courage. In later literature, Cassandra acquires further dimensions. She becomes a symbol of rejected knowledge, of political blindness, of misunderstood women, of the limits of rational authority, and of the pain of foresight. The Romans inherited and reshaped her as they did so many Greek figures, allowing her to wander into a new literary climate where fate, duty, and memory were all closely observed. Tragedy gave her a stage. Epic gave her a city. Philosophy gave her a problem. Art gave her a face. Each era received her differently, as though the curse itself had become a kind of test for the listener. Do we understand her now? Do we hear her now? Or do we only admire the elegance of the myth while missing the urgency inside it? There is no need to answer too quickly. Bedtime stories are not meant for hurried conclusions. They unfold in the mind like fabric being loosened from a fold. The more calmly we return to them, the more detail becomes visible. Cassandra's image often appears in later paintings as a woman caught between knowledge and alarm, her body turned slightly away, as if she were already withdrawing from a scene she can no longer alter. Some artists emphasize her despair, others give her a kind of fierce inward light. These portrayals, spread across centuries, remind us how much a single myth can absorb. The figure remains recognizable even as the style changes around her. There is a quiet kind of historical meditation in that. We think of ancient myths as fixed, but they were once alive in performance and retelling. A singer in one generation may have paused at a different line than a poet in another. A dramatist might have drawn out Cassandra's grief, while a storyteller in a smaller setting might have emphasized the ominous humor of being right too late. That flexibility helped the myth survive. It also makes it feel close to the way memory itself works. Human recollection is not exact. It is layered, partial, and often shaped by what is most emotionally necessary. We remember the outline first and the grain of it later, if at all. The outline of Cassandra's story remains clear. She is granted vision and denied persuasion. She foresees calamity and is not believed. Troy falls. Her voice survives. Yet around that outline, many subtler details drift like dust in late sunlight. There is the question of how prophecy was understood in the ancient Mediterranean. Prophecy was not simply prediction in the modern sense. It could be a form of inspired utterance, dream interpretation, sacred memory, or warning woven from signs. It belonged to temples, oracles, sacrifices, and rituals that linked humans with the divine order. In that context, Cassandra's gift is not merely supernatural spectacle. It is an extension of a culture that took the unseen seriously. And when we consider the cult of Apollo, the god associated with music, healing, plague, and clarity, the myth gains another layer of quiet resonance. Apollo is often portrayed as bright, orderly, and distant, a god of measured beauty, but myths often reveal the shadow side of divine gifts. Light can illuminate, and light can expose. Knowledge can guide, and knowledge can isolate. Apollo's connection to Cassandra suggests that wisdom is never entirely gentle. Even insight can wound the one who carries it. That is a thought to keep softly, not as a burden, but as part of the texture of the old story. The tragic poets knew how to hold such textures. Greek tragedy, especially, lingered over moments of recognition, delay, and reversal. It explored what happens when character and fate meet in impossible arrangements. Cassandra fits this world perfectly. She is not only a warning figure, she is a tragic consciousness. She knows the shape of what is coming, and therefore she inhabits time differently from those around her. Others move toward the future in innocence. She moves toward it in grief. That difference can feel almost unbearable, and yet the poetry of it lies in the stillness before the collapse. The audience sees the tension tightening while the characters continue with their plans, unaware or unwilling to admit the truth. This dramatic irony, though, is not merely a literary device. It mirrors real life. There are always moments when someone sees further than those around them, and the problem is rarely lack of words alone. Sometimes people resist warnings because the truth would ask too much of them. To believe is to change course, and changing course can be costly. Kings want certainty, cities want continuation, families want peace, so the warning is set aside, folded away, or mocked. Cassandra stands at the crossing of that refusal. Her solitude is created not because she lacks truth, but because truth asks for too much at once. Still, the myth does not end in total darkness. There is a strange and subtle endurance in her afterlife. Cassandra becomes remembered precisely because she was not heeded. Her failure to alter the outcome gives her a kind of literary immortality. She belongs to the defeated and therefore to memory, and memory is a slow, patient form of justice. It cannot restore the city, but it can restore attention. It can bring the neglected voice back into the room. That is perhaps why the tale feels so tender when told in a quiet hour. It gives back to Cassandra the listening she lacked in the story itself. One might imagine the great libraries of later antiquity, with their scrolls and shelves, their scholars leaning over texts by lamplight, copying lines that had already crossed many hands. The old myths passed through such places in fragments and compilations, preserved by the care of readers who themselves may have never seen Troy in imagination except through words. A story like Cassandra's would have survived thanks to this chain of attentiveness. A scribe's careful hand, a teacher's recitation, a student's memory, a poet's desire to preserve a line all contributed to the long afterlife of the curse. History is built from such small acts, often unnoticed. The grand tale depends upon the quiet labor of keeping, and keeping is a fitting word here. Cassandra keeps knowledge, she keeps grief, she keeps the future before it arrives. Her burden is inward, but it radiates outward into the world around her. The myth invites us to think about the weight of hidden things. Not all knowledge is liberating in the moment. Some truths arrive too soon to be useful, and yet they shape the soul that carries them. The ancients who watched the movements of stars and the cycles of seasons probably understood this better than we sometimes do. They knew that timing matters. A seed planted too early or too late may not grow. A warning spoken in a season of pride may find no soil. The story of Cassandra, then, is also a story about timing. There is a tragic mismatch between insight and reception. She speaks before others are ready. She sees before others have turned their minds to the matter. This mismatch is one of the most painful forms of loneliness, and yet from a broader perspective it reveals how hope itself is structured. People often live as if tomorrow will remain obedient to today. A prophet or witness interrupts that comfort. The interruption is unwelcome, but it is not without purpose. It marks the point where fantasy and reality begin to separate. In mythic terms, that separation can be expressed through image. The city walls, the wooden horse, the altar, the chamber, the torchlight, the fallen king, the captive princess, the silenced seeress. Each image carries its own hush. None needs to hurry. They can be held one by one, like beads passed slowly between fingers. This is part of what makes myth so comforting at bedtime, even when the story is sorrowful. It works by accumulation rather than shock. It invites the mind to settle into pattern. Once inside the pattern, we can reflect on the human beings who lived and suffered within it, and in doing so we come to feel a little less alone in our own uncertainty. There are also broader historical echoes to Cassandra's figure. Cultures across the ancient world imagined seers, wise women, dream interpreters, and oracle figures. Some were honored, some were feared, some were both. In Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Levant, and in the wider Greek sphere, people sought signs in the ordinary and extraordinary alike. The boundaries between religion, medicine, politics, and interpretation were often porous. A dream could carry divine meaning. A disease might be read as a cosmic disturbance. A ruler's downfall could be understood as a rupture in moral order. Cassandra stands in that wide landscape of interpretation, a Greek emblem of a much older human tendency to ask the world what it intends. And yet Cassandra's answer, unlike some oracular pronouncements, is clear. She is not cryptic for the sake of mystery. The cruel irony lies in her plainness. Perhaps that is why her story lingers so strongly. The warning is comprehensible. The refusal is comprehensible. The tragedy lies not in obscurity, but in the failure of relation. One person sees, another does not want to see. One voice speaks, many listen only with their expectations. Ancient myth often creates its deepest sorrow not through confusion, but through clarity without acceptance. As the night becomes deeper, it may be comforting to remember that stories like this were once spoken aloud by voices in rooms not unlike our own in their dimness. There would have been oil lamps, perhaps, or firelight reflecting on polished bronze. The storyteller's cadence would slow in the same way a lullaby does. Long before books were common, long before printed pages and digital screens, memory carried the tale from mouth to mouth. A listener would close their eyes and imagine a city in flames, a woman in lament, a god displeased, a future already sealed. The ancient act of listening itself was an act of hospitality. It made room for the strange and the sorrowful. It gave them a place to rest. That is what the myth still offers. Rest, not in the sense of comfort without pain, but in the sense of holding pain gently enough that it can be understood. Cassandra's story asks us to dwell on the edges of certainty and compassion. It asks us to consider how often truth is present before the world is ready for it. It asks us to imagine the lonely labor of those who perceive danger, injustice, or change and must nonetheless speak into the wind. There is sadness in that, yes, but also a stern and quiet honor, and perhaps if we listen carefully enough, we can hear another layer beneath the tragedy. Cassandra is not only the voice of ignored warning, she is also the survivor of a ruined language of trust. Her curse is that speech no longer works as it should. That is a profound mythic injury. Speech binds communities. It promises reciprocity. To be heard is one form of being held. To be disbelieved is a kind of falling through the floor of the social world. The myth renders that injury visible. By doing so, it gives shape to a pain that many people have felt in quieter, less dramatic forms. The story does not heal the wound, but it acknowledges it with remarkable tenderness. We can also see in Cassandra a rare blend of intimacy and distance. She belongs to a legendary age, to royal houses and divine interventions, but her emotional experience is immediate. She is afraid, she is frustrated, she is sorrowful, she is isolated. Those feelings do not belong to any one era. They travel across centuries without losing their shape. A person in a modern city hearing the myth late at night can still recognize themselves in her attention sharpened by concern, in her isolation, in the exhaustion of knowing what others refuse to know. That recognition is part of the story's quiet power. It makes antiquity feel near without disturbing the calm. In some versions, Cassandra's fate after Troy is bound up with further sorrow, taken into captivity and carried away from her ruined homeland. The image is devastating, and yet even that part of the story can be considered with a soft historical gaze. The movement of women as captives, the transfer of spoils after war, the erasure of homes, the folding of lives into the victor's narratives, these are patterns repeated across history far beyond myth. The old stories preserve not only divine drama but the social realities of conquest. Cassandra's body becomes a site where power is displayed. Her voice, however, remains the most enduring thing about her. Powers can seize bodies. They cannot so easily seize the memory of speech. That memory is especially moving because it is incomplete. We do not possess Cassandra in a single authoritative form. We have fragments, references, dramatic scenes, later echoes. There is no perfect original to return to. In that sense, her survival resembles archaeology itself. A shard of pottery suggests the whole vessel. A wall foundation suggests a room now absent. A line quoted by a later writer suggests a poem once fuller than what remains. Myths, like ruins, let us imagine beyond the visible. They invite tenderness toward absence. The gaps are not failures. They are part of the atmosphere. They allow the imagination to move quietly among what time has left behind. Time, indeed, is one of the most important presences in the myth. Cassandra's curse is temporal as much as emotional. She lives in a tense relation with what is about to happen. In that way, she resembles the ancient practice of reading signs in the sky or by the entrails of sacrificial animals, trying to discern pattern in the imminent future. But unlike the formal diviner, she cannot alter the reception of her message. She is stuck between certainty and consequence. That tension makes her one of the most haunting figures in the mythic world. She does not simply know the future, she inhabits its shadow before it arrives. There is a kind of hush in that idea. The shadow of an event can be longer than the event itself. The anticipation of loss often begins before the loss is visible. Cassandra lives in that pre-loss space. Her experience invites us to think about the emotional geography of dread. Not panic exactly, not chaos. Something steadier and more difficult, the weight of seeing too far ahead, the sorrow of being unable to slow the coming hour, the loneliness of being correct in advance. It is a strange landscape, but a very human one. Ancient storytellers knew how to place figures within such landscapes. They gave gods their distances, heroes their burdens, mortals their limits. Cassandra sits between all three categories in a complicated way. She is mortal but touched by divinity. She is royal but powerless. She is central to the story but unable to change it. That layered position gives her a still, luminous importance. She is a threshold figure. Thresholds are quiet places. They are not fully inside or outside. They are places of passage, hesitation, and pause. Cassandra stands on one, and the myth keeps her there for us to contemplate. To contemplate her is to contemplate the strange dignity of unmet expectation. The city expects safety and receives destruction. The family expects continuity and receives rupture. The listener expects a triumph of warning and receives tragedy. Yet the shape of the story itself remains satisfying in a deeper sense because it names something real without pretending to solve it. Myth can do that. It can hold contradiction gently. It can let sorrow remain sorrow and still be meaningful. It can allow a cursed voice to continue sounding long after the palace has gone dark. If one were to imagine the ancient night surrounding Troy after the catastrophe, it would be very quiet indeed. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows fire, confusion, and exhaustion. In such a silence, Cassandra's voice would be absent from the living scene, and yet present in memory. That is how many voices survive history, as echo, as rumor, as literary inheritance. A myth preserves them in a form neither fully alive nor fully gone. The result is a kind of half-light, which is often where bedtime stories do their best work. In half-light, the mind relaxes. In half-light, details may remain, but they no longer demand immediate response. They can be simply held, and so Cassandra may rest there now in the inherited dusk of the story, with all her seeing and all her sorrow folded into the long endurance of telling. The gods have gone quiet. The palace stones have cooled. The sea has continued its ancient breathing beyond the shore. A city once feared and celebrated becomes a memory of walls, and a woman once dismissed becomes a voice that outlasts the moment of disbelief. This is the soft paradox at the heart of the myth. What is ignored in life may be honored in remembrance. What fails to persuade in the hour of danger may persuade across centuries in the calmer work of reflection. That is perhaps the most tender justice a story can offer. Not reversal, not rescue, but remembrance. To remember Cassandra is to let her remain a bearer of truth even after the event she foresaw has long passed into history. It is to keep company with a figure who lived at the edge of hearing and still spoke. It is to acknowledge that some voices are made more luminous by the fact that they were not welcomed at first. They arrive late to our understanding, but not too late to matter. And as the tale eases toward its final stillness, it can do so with no need for strain. There is no loud closing. There is only the quiet settling of myth into memory, like dust in a beam of moonlight. The ancient city remains a name, a ruin, a question. The prophetess remains a figure of sadness and endurance. The gods remain distant, as they often are. And we remain here, listening in the softened dark, carrying the story with a little more care than before. So let the night receive Cassandra gently. Let her curse lose some of its sting in the long patience of retelling. Let the old walls of Troy stand for a moment in the mind and then dissolve again into shadow. Let the voice that was once unheard be heard here, softly, without urgency, without fear. The future has already become history. The history has already become story. And the story, quiet now, can rest. After the fall of Troy, the world of Greek myth does not become suddenly brighter or simpler. It grows, if anything, more hushed. The smoke from the burning city gives way to long journeys, to scattered households, to memories that travel farther than armies ever did. Cassandra belongs to that aftermath as much as she belongs to the palace on the hill. Her story does not end with the opening of the gates. It continues in the dim and careful spaces after disaster, where people must decide what, if anything, can still be trusted. There is something especially melancholy about figures who know the future and yet cannot alter it. In many traditions, prophecy is treated as a gift, but in Cassandra's case it becomes a kind of lonely burden. She knows too much, and the knowing brings no comfort. Her insight does not brighten the room. It only reveals how little can be changed once certain paths have already begun. In this way, her myth feels older than the details of Troy itself. It touches a very ancient human fear, the fear that recognition may come too late, that understanding may be real and still powerless. Ancient cultures often lived closer to uncertainty than modern people like to imagine. A voyage might fail because of weather. A harvest might be damaged by a sudden dry season or an unseasonable flood. A city's fate might depend on alliances made in rooms where the oil lamps burned low, and the men speaking over them hoped the gods were listening. In such a world, signs mattered, omens mattered, dreams mattered. The line between event and interpretation was thinner than it is for many people now. Cassandra's role sits right on that line. She is not simply a speaker of facts. She is a speaker of meanings that others refuse to accept. That refusal is one of the quietest horrors in her tale. It does not come with violence at first, it comes with dismissal. It comes with a smile that does not believe, a glance that drifts away, a conversation that changes the subject. To be ignored is a very ordinary kind of suffering, which may be why the story of Cassandra has remained so haunting for so long. Most listeners can recognize the feeling, even without the prophecy. Most have known in some smaller and more personal way what it is to be certain of something and not be heard. Myth often survives because it gives shape to common emotions, and Cassandra gives shape to the ache of being right and not being received. The ancient Greeks had many ways of imagining knowledge. Wisdom could belong to elders, to poets, to kings, to seers, to travelers, to those who had suffered, and to those who had listened carefully. Yet not every kind of knowing carried equal authority. There was practical knowledge, like the art of steering a ship or preparing a meal. There was civic knowledge, like the skill of speaking in an assembly. There was sacred knowledge, like the patterns read in birds or flames or sacrifice. Cassandra is folded into that last category, but the myth refuses to let sacred knowledge triumph by itself. Instead, it becomes strangely isolated, almost fragile. She can know but not compel belief. That distinction matters more than it may first seem. In the oldest preserved Greek literature, the world is full of such tensions. A man may be brave but not victorious. A king may be powerful but not wise. A hero may be beloved but still doomed. The poems of Homer, though composed in an oral tradition, preserve a world in which greatness and suffering are often braided together. Cassandra fits naturally into that landscape. She is not outside the logic of the epics. She is one of its sharpest expressions. If heroes in Greek myth are often measured by what they endure, Cassandra is measured by what she sees in advance and cannot soften. There is also a special stillness in the fact that so much of her story survives only through fragments of larger traditions. We know her through retellings, through allusions, through poets who inherited her and passed her onward. That is true of many ancient figures, especially women whose voices were shaped by later authors. The surviving record is not a complete room but a set of windows. Through them, we glimpse scenes rather than owning them whole. And perhaps this fragmentary quality suits Cassandra. A broken record of her life feels oddly fitting for a woman whose truth was always partial to others, always filtered through disbelief. The gaps around her become part of the atmosphere. In some versions of the myth, Cassandra is associated with the temple of Apollo. The god of light, order, prophecy, and music becomes entangled with her fate in a way that is both luminous and unsettling. Apollo is a complicated deity, as Greek gods so often are. He presides over clarity, yet his gifts can bring difficulty. He offers insight, but not necessarily ease. In the great imaginative architecture of ancient religion, gods are not gentle simplifications. They are powers with many moods. Apollo can be a healer and a destroyer, a patron of harmony and a bringer of plague. In that sense, the god who grants Cassandra prophecy is already a reminder that divine favor is not the same thing as human comfort. The image of prophecy itself is a quiet one if we look at it closely. It is often represented not as thunder but as listening. A prophet hears something others cannot hear. A hint in the air, a message in a dream, a pattern in a bird's flight, a phrase from a god, a sensation that settles in the body like a chill before rain. The drama of prophecy depends on what follows afterward, but the moment of receiving it is often inward and still. Cassandra's gift is not a theatrical spectacle all the time. It may be a burden of perception, an ever-present attentiveness, a mind that cannot rest because it sees consequences beginning where others see only beginnings. And yet the ancient world was full of places where people went to seek precisely that kind of uneasy knowledge. Oracles and sanctuaries occupied landscapes that often felt removed from ordinary life. Delphi, with its mountain setting and sacred atmosphere, was one such place. Dodona was another, older and quieter in tone, where voices of the divine were said to move through rustling leaves and bronze. Even beyond formal cults, there were countless local customs, household rituals, and forms of divination woven into daily existence. People lived among signs. They learned to look and to interpret. Cassandra belongs to that culture of interpretation, but her tragedy is that interpretation fails at the last moment where it matters most. The fall of Troy itself has attracted countless retellings because it stands at the border between legend and cultural memory. Whether or not there was a historical city that inspired the tale, the myth has become one of the central stories of the ancient Mediterranean imagination. Excavations at Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey revealed layers of settlement, reminding scholars that a real place lay beneath the poetry, though not in any simple one-to-one way. Ruins have a way of making legend feel new. A stratified mound can suggest centuries of habitation, rebuilding, and loss. In such a place, one can imagine how memory accumulates. One city becomes many cities. One destruction becomes part of a long sequence. And out of that layered earth rises the great literary Troy, half archaeology, half dream. Cassandra in the story is not concerned with archaeology. She is concerned with the immediate future, with the wooden horse, with the danger hidden in apparent gifts, with the doors that should not be opened. Her warnings carry the plain urgency of someone standing near an edge. But the myth also lets her become something broader than a single moment. She becomes a symbol of insight without power, of truth without authority, of knowledge that cannot alter the will of a community already leaning toward disaster. In this respect, she belongs to the large family of tragic figures who understand the shape of their fate but cannot divert it. Greek myth is full of such figures because it understands, perhaps better than many other storytelling traditions, that awareness does not guarantee escape. When we think about the ancient setting, it can be soothing to remember that life there was also made of ordinary textures. Stone walls warmed in the sun, clay vessels cooled in the shade. Linen was washed, folded, and worn, bread was baked, water was carried, children played in courtyards. Even in palaces, much of life would have been composed of repetition and small duties. Against that backdrop, a prophetess would not have stood all day in dramatic posture. She would have existed amid the ordinary rhythms of domestic and political life, and this makes her isolation more poignant. There is no need for constant thunder to create sorrow. Sometimes a single unheeded sentence is enough. The figure of Cassandra also invites us to notice how often myth turns the act of speaking into a test. Speech can bless or fail, heal or wound, persuade or vanish into air. In many ancient stories, eloquence is a prized ability. Heroes speak in council. Priests speak in ritual. Poets speak to preserve memory. But Cassandra's speech is a paradox. It is rich with meaning and poor in reception. The problem is not the content of her words. It is the condition of the listeners. This subtle shift from speaker to audience gives the myth much of its emotional force. It reminds us that communication is never just about expression. It is also about recognition, hospitality, and trust. Trust itself is a delicate ancient thing. In a world of long journeys, uncertain borders, and shifting alliances, trust had to be earned carefully. Communities knew the value of oath, kinship, guest friendship, and ritual exchange. When trust broke, it could take generations to restore. Cassandra's disbelief belongs to that broader human experience. The city does not trust its warning. The family does not trust the urgency in her voice. Perhaps they cannot imagine that the forms of intelligence they already value might be insufficient. Perhaps it is easier to think her mad than to alter the plans already set in motion. Human beings often prefer the comfort of a familiar mistake to the discomfort of a necessary change. There is, however, no need to reduce Cassandra to mere victimhood. She is also stubbornly herself. Even in versions of the story where she is degraded, captured, or carried away as spoils of war, she remains a figure of inward force. Her dignity does not come from success, it comes from persistence. The refusal of others does not erase the fact of her seeing. In this, she resembles certain other mythic women who endure the limits imposed on them without surrendering their inner reality. Greek myth often gives us women whose voices are constrained by circumstance, yet whose presence continues to disturb the story long after their first appearance. Cassandra is among the most quietly enduring of these. Ancient audiences may have understood her not only as a character, but as a kind of warning about the unstable relation between divine and human speech. What if the gods speak, but the world is too noisy to hear? What if truth requires a kind of social readiness that is not always present? These questions are old, and they remain gentle companions to a sleepless mind. They do not demand answers. They hover. Myth excels at hovering. It allows a person to sit with uncertainty without solving it all at once. That is one reason these stories can be so restful. They hold tension in a form the mind can follow without strain. The story of Cassandra has also travelled through the long history of literature because it can be shaped to many purposes. Tragedians used her to intensify the sorrow of Troy. Later writers found in her a symbol of political warning ignored by rulers. Modern readers sometimes see in her a figure for the artist whose vision arrives too early, or the person whose anxiety is dismissed as exaggeration. Each era hears a different resonance, yet beneath all these interpretations lies the same simple structure: a speaker, a warning, a refusal, a consequence. The structure is so clear that it feels almost like a bell tolling at a distance. Not loud, just persistent. The ancient Greeks did not think of myth as childish fantasy in the modern sense. Myths were part of the cultural bloodstream. They explained family lines, sacred customs, regional identities, and the moral texture of the world. They were remembered in festivals, sung in performances, and shared in domestic conversation. A figure like Cassandra would have been encountered not as an isolated literary motif, but as part of a larger web of stories. Her presence in one tale would point to others, to Agamemnon, to Helen, to Clytemnestra, to the long aftermath of the war. She sits near the center of one of the most resonant story clusters in Greek imagination, and yet she herself remains elusive. That elusiveness is part of her charm. She is vivid without ever becoming simple. We might think of how often ancient stories move between public and private spaces. Troy is a public city, a place of armies and walls, but Cassandra's deepest wound is intimate. It unfolds in family rooms, in chambers, in conversations no one takes seriously enough. Many myths use the grandeur of kings and gods to reveal domestic pain. The scale changes, but the emotional pattern remains recognizable. A daughter is not believed. A household cannot hold itself together. A warning enters the room and leaves without effect. In that sense, Cassandra's story is both royal and very close to home. It occupies palaces, but it speaks to any listener who has known the silence of being dismissed. One can also linger over the image of the wooden horse because it is such a wonderfully still object in the midst of a war story. It is motionless and seemingly harmless. It does not charge, it does not shout. It waits. That waiting is its danger. The horse is a container for hidden intention, and Cassandra's warning is a recognition of concealed reality. She sees through appearance into the quiet mechanism of deception. The tragedy is that the city admires the object's strangeness more than it fears its meaning. Humans are often drawn to what appears impressive, novel, or ceremonially offered. A gift can be especially persuasive when it arrives in silence. Cassandra knows that silence can be a mask. This theme of hidden danger behind beautiful or impressive surfaces appears often in myth. Ancient stories are fond of things that glitter but mislead, of feasts that conceal resentment, of alliances that hide betrayal, of marriage offers with darker histories beneath them. The Greek imagination seems deeply aware that form can deceive. Cassandra's tale simply stages that awareness in its most heartbreaking way. She becomes the one person in the room who understands that the beautiful object is not simply beautiful, it is fateful. To see fate inside a gift is to see too much for comfort, yet the myth does not ask us to despise beauty. The horse remains an image of strange craftsmanship and symbolic power. The city remains beautiful in its imagined strength. Cassandra herself is described in many sources as royal, radiant, memorable, and noble. The tragedy lies not in beauty, but in beauty's inability to protect. This is another quiet truth that the old stories know well. Splendor and vulnerability often belong together. A shining thing may be fragile. A great city may be mortal. A gifted mind may remain unheard. If we drift for a moment into the wider ancient Mediterranean world, we can see that many cultures placed special weight on the figure of the seer. Egyptian religion had its sacred specialists. Mesopotamian courts employed diviners who read the liver of a sacrificed animal or watched for celestial patterns. In the Hebrew tradition, prophets speak difficult words to kings and communities. Across these traditions, the seer occupies a dangerous threshold. To announce what others do not wish to hear is to stand near both authority and danger. Cassandra feels at home among these figures, even though her story is shaped by Greek poetic imagination. She belongs to a larger human history of those who say what is unwelcome because it is true. The quietness of such figures is often overlooked. We imagine prophecy as spectacle because the stories are dramatic. But the lived reality of warning may be a conversation in a doorway, a sentence repeated patiently, a pleading tone that grows tired. Cassandra's voice in some imagined ancient room might have sounded less like thunder and more like fatigue. The burden of being unheard can wear a voice down. It is worth remembering this softness. Mythic figures are sometimes more moving when we picture the ordinary effort of their lives rather than only the grand symbols they later become. There is also a kind of loneliness in being the keeper of knowledge that cannot be shared effectively. Cassandra's solitude is not total because she lives among people, but it is still profound. She may see crowd scenes, banquet tables, preparations for departures, rituals in the courtyard, and all the while remain apart in the most interior sense. Many stories of prophets and seers contain this loneliness. The gift of insight often separates rather than joins. To perceive too clearly can be to lose the ordinary comfort of consensus. The world becomes more layered, but also more isolated. Cassandra embodies that cost. The ancient imagination often respected such costs even when it did not resolve them. A tragedy did not need to end well to feel complete. In fact, completion could arise from the very recognition that some wounds cannot be mended by plot alone. Cassandra's story reaches this kind of completeness. It does not persuade the Trojans, it persuades the audience. The scene of disbelief becomes a lesson for the listener, not because it amends the past, but because it sharpens our sense of attention. The myth asks us to become better hearers than the people within it. This is a quiet and generous demand. Even in later art and literature, Cassandra tends to retain this unsettling clarity. She appears as a voice from the margins, someone whose truth is recognized retrospectively. That retrospective recognition is deeply human. We are often better at understanding warning after the danger has passed. History itself is full of such delayed comprehension. Kingdoms fall, ships sink, treaties unravel, and only afterward do chroniclers assemble the causes into a story that seems obvious in hindsight. Cassandra's myth has lasted because it gives that hindsight a face. She is the embodiment of the sentence, "We should have listened." A very small sentence, and one of the oldest in human memory. There is a delicate grief in that phrase. It acknowledges responsibility without pretending that responsibility changes everything. The point is not to erase the event, but to see it more honestly. Myth at its best trains this kind of sight. It does not prevent sorrow, it clarifies its shape. Cassandra's story is useful in that way, if usefulness is the right word for something so tender. It is useful because it helps us name the pain of neglected truth. It is useful because it allows the mind to rest in recognition rather than confusion. And recognition, even when sorrowful, can be strangely soothing. In the dim places of the ancient world, people also depended on memory as a form of continuity. Before and beside written texts, stories were carried by voice. Genealogies, hymns, local legends, heroic cycles, rituals, and proverbs moved from person to person. Cassandra, though a tragic figure, is also a triumph of memory in this sense. She survives because storytellers found her worth repeating. Her voice was ignored within the tale, but not in the tradition that preserved her. There is a kind of gentle compensation there. The myth creates what history denied. A dismissed woman becomes unforgettable. This does not mean the story is cheerful. It means only that it has a deep cultural afterlife. Stories that survive often do so because they contain a pattern that keeps speaking to new listeners. Cassandra's pattern is simple enough to remember and rich enough to revisit. A warning offered, a warning refused, a consequence fulfilled. But inside that simplicity lies an entire emotional landscape. There is pride, fear, love, resentment, faith, impatience, and the almost unbearable sadness of being correct in the wrong moment. It is a small architecture that opens into a vast interior. It may help, too, to imagine the quieter domestic details of Troy as the myths present it. The palace would have had storerooms for grain, oils, textiles, and wine. Servants would have moved through corridors. Metalwork would have glittered. Looms may have stood in shadowed spaces where women worked by rhythm and habit. Even in a royal household, the days would have been structured by practical necessities. Cassandra is often remembered only in the most dramatic hour, but she must also have lived through the ordinary intervals between warnings, through mornings and meals and pauses in conversation. A prophetess does not exist only at the peak of catastrophe. She has a life before and after each utterance. The myth leaves much of that life in soft focus, which gives the imagination room to rest. There is something especially ancient feeling about the idea of someone whose truth is only fully recognized after death or destruction. So much of the surviving past is known in that way. We read inscriptions from broken stones. We reconstruct ceremonies from fragments of vessels. We infer daily life from tools, ash layers, and ruined foundations. History itself is often a Cassandra-like discipline, piecing together warnings from partial remains. Archaeologists and historians know very well that evidence can be both eloquent and incomplete. A potsherd may speak volumes, but not in a straightforward tongue. The past is always half-heard. Perhaps that is why Cassandra feels so at home beside ruins. Ruins are among the quietest things humans make. They are architecture after urgency has faded. They hold shape without function. They suggest lives and intentions that no longer operate. Troy, as a ruin in the imagination, is like that. It is not merely a destroyed city. It is a preserved absence. Cassandra belongs to the same atmosphere. She is a preserved absence of authority, a voice that remains in the record because it was once denied. There is no need to force the image. It is already strong enough. A ruined city on a hill, a woman speaking into disbelief, a silence after fire. These are the materials of the myth, and they settle together naturally. The bedtime mind may find peace in the knowledge that even the most painful stories have contours. They do not remain chaotic forever once told. Cassandra's tale has been shaped, revisited, analyzed, and reimagined for many centuries. That human act of retelling is itself gentle. It does not heal her, but it acknowledges her. It turns suffering into memory, and memory into something that can be carried more lightly. One does not need to solve the myth to rest within it. One only needs to listen as it slowly becomes familiar. And perhaps that is the deepest truth Cassandra leaves us with, that the world is full of meanings that arrive before their audience is ready. Some warnings come too early, some insights find no welcome, some forms of wisdom stand in the room like a quiet lamp while everyone else looks elsewhere. This is not only tragic, it is also instructive. It asks for humility. It asks for patience. It asks us to admit that our certainty about what matters may itself be limited. Such an admission is not harsh. It is restful because it releases the need to know everything at once. So the myth continues to drift, as myths do, through the dark corridors of memory. It moves past the Bronze Age world that may once have inspired it, past the poets who shaped it, past the centuries of readers who heard in Cassandra their own private disappointments and warnings. It enters the present softly, without demanding attention, and sits for a little while beside the listening mind. There is no need to hurry it along. The ancient city can remain half seen, the prophetess can remain half heard, the gods can remain distant and unresolved. The story knows how to rest inside that uncertainty. And now, in that resting place, Cassandra seems less like a figure of noise than a figure of enduring quiet. Her curse was to be unheard, but the myth itself has made a patient answer to that curse. It has preserved her words across time. It has given her an afterlife in literature, in thought, in the still hours before sleep. A woman once dismissed now belongs to the long archive of human remembrance. A warning once ignored now becomes part of the wisdom of the evening. The future has become old history. The old history has become a soft story. And the story, having travelled so far, can finally settle into silence.